All right, folks, lean in for a second because today we're stepping into one of the most misunderstood, overhyped, and honestly kind of terrifying ideas in the whole psychedelic universe, the so-called heroic dose. And I know the internet loves to treat it like some spiritual boss fight or cosmic flex, but when you actually listen to the real experts, people like Dr. Matthew Johnson, who've spent decades studying this stuff in controlled environments, you realize this isn't about being brave or reckless or chasing crazy visuals. This is about going so deep into your own mind that the usual walls you hide behind just vanish. And that's why this conversation matters, because the myths, the memes, the wild stories, they all miss the point. So today, we're stripping away the nonsense and getting into what a heroic dose really means from someone who actually knows, someone who's seen how intense, humbling, and unbelievably personal these experiences can be. So buckle up, take a breath, because this one gets weird in the best possible way when you really start diving into this whole idea of a heroic dose, especially the way Dr. Matthew Johnson talks about it. You realize it's one of those things that the internet absolutely loves to exaggerate while completely missing the point of what's actually going on, because people online treat it like some kind of extreme sport challenge, like the psychedelic version of climbing Everest without oxygen. But when you listen to someone who spent decades studying this stuff in controlled clinical environments, you quickly understand how far the myth is from the science. And honestly, that gap is fascinating because the word heroic itself sounds like something you'd use to describe a Marvel movie moment. But in reality, when Dr. Johnson uses the term or even comments on it, he's pointing towards something much deeper, something internal, something psychological and therapeutic, something that has nothing to do with bragging rights or ego flexing, and everything to do with confronting aspects of the mind that most people spend their entire lives running from without even realizing it. And that's where the Joe Rogan curiosity kicks in. Because whenever you talk to people who VE had profound experiences, or you read the clinical reports coming out of Johns Hopkins, you notice a pattern. It's always about that internal journey, that deep dive into the subconscious, that moment where the usual mental filters just dissolve and you're left facing raw reality, almost stripped of identity, stripped of narrative, stripped of the constant chatter that defines everyday consciousness. And that's a big part of why scientists treat these sessions with so much structure, so much preparation, so much respect, because at the level where ego dissolution becomes likely, which is where people tend to use this term heroic dose, the experience is less like a trip and more like a psychological event, a full confrontation with why, ourself. But of course, the internet doesn't talk about that. The internet doesn't talk about the screening process, the therapist, the long preparation interviews, the monitoring, the safety protocols, the integration sessions afterward. The internet focuses on the dose amount like it's some kind of magic number. Like if you just cross a certain line, suddenly the universe unlocks a cheat code and gives you cosmic Wi-Fi access. But that's not at all how experts like Dr. Matthew Johnson frame it, because for them, the dosage number is just one variable among dozens. Mental health history, emotional readiness, therapeutic goals, the setting, the guide, the music, the intention, all of that matters. In fact, Dr. Johnson repeatedly emphasizes that the most meaningful part of these sessions is actually the integration afterward, because that's where people take whatever insights they had, whether emotional, symbolic, or completely indescribable, and try to make sense of them in the context of their real lives. And that part is slow, often challenging, and definitely not glamorous, but it's where the real change tends to happen. And this is something Joe Rogan talks about all the time, the idea that these substances aren't shortcuts to enlightenment, they're tools. And tools can help you build something, or they can hurt you if you use them recklessly, which is why these research environments are so intentional, so controlled, so carefully designed, almost like a psychological launch pad where the entire job of the team is to make sure the participant is safe while they explore something most people never experience. Because when Dr. Johnson talks about ego dissolution at high doses, he's not describing some mystical superhero moment. He's describing a neurological shift where certain brain networks, especially the default mode network, temporarily quiet down, which creates this odd, profound, often overwhelming experience of the self disappearing. And that sounds terrifying for some people and liberating for others. But either way, it's intense. And that intensity is exactly why a heroic dose is not a recreational concept, not a party environment thing, not an impulsive decision, but something scientifically studied, medically monitored, and emotionally prepared for in ways the general public rarely understands. And if you think about how Rogan would discuss it, he'd probably focus on the contrast between how mainstream media paints psychedelics, usually simplistic and fear-based, and how the new wave of research is revealing that these substances, under the right conditions, can help people confront trauma, reevaluate deeply held beliefs, break cycles of rumination, and sometimes experience a sense of connection or unity that shifts their worldview in long-lasting ways. But again, that's not because the dose is heroic in the internet sense. It's because the process is structured and supported to allow the mind to open without collapsing into fear or confusion. And this is where Dr. Johnson's calm, scientific tone becomes so important, because he consistently warns against treating psychedelics like some shortcut or life hack. He says the real transformation isn't during the session itself, even if the session feels monumental, but in the weeks and months afterward, when the brain is more flexible, more introspective, more open to change, and the person starts applying those insights to their relationships, their habits, their self-talk, their goals, their emotional patterns, all the small stuff that actually shapes life. And this part is so rarely mentioned online. But Joe Rogan often highlights exactly this, the idea that the healing isn't in the trip. It's in the work you do afterward, the conversations you have, the choices you make, the behaviors you shift, because psychedelics don't magically fix your problems. They show you things, sometimes uncomfortable things, and then you have to do something with that. And that's especially true for high-dose ego-dissolving experiences, because if the ego melts and you glimpse some alternate way of seeing yourself or the world, but you do nothing with that afterward, then it becomes just a story, an anecdote, not a catalyst. And in the research work that Dr. Johnson leads, they take integration so seriously that they sometimes spend more time preparing and integrating than administering the dose itself. And that tells you something. It tells you that the dose is only one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that involves neuroscience, psychology, trust, intention, and emotional readiness. But the online myth turns the whole thing into a macho challenge, which completely misses the point, because a truly heroic experience in the therapeutic sense isn't about taking more. It's about letting go, surrendering, facing yourself, and doing the work afterward to live differently. And that's why Dr. Johnson's perspective matters, because he's not talking as a guru or a hype man or a spiritual influencer. He's talking as a researcher who's watched hundreds of sessions, documented their outcomes, analyzed their patterns, and understands better than almost anyone how intense, unpredictable, and deeply personal these experiences can be. And that's the real story behind the heroic dose. Not the sensational version, not the social media version, but the grounded, scientific, psychological reality that reveals just how complex and delicate the human mind is, and how, under the right circumstances, it can open in ways that are both mysterious and profoundly meaningful.